Assessing Democracy, 0.04. This thing just keeps getting closer and closer each time. Back off. Back off. Okay. There we go. I want to talk now about the difference between authority and legitimacy. Okay? And then we're going to make some distinctions about different kinds of governments. So authority is the power of the government to enforce its decisions and compel obedience. The power of the government, not the right of the government, but the power of the government to enforce its decisions and compel obedience. Right? So for example, in our political system, our government has authority. If you want to find out whether or not they have the power to enforce their decisions and compel your obedience, go ahead and get on the freeway and drive on the wrong side of the freeway backwards. Okay? And then see if they have the power to enforce their decisions and compel obedience, as long as you don't crash and kill yourself and somebody else. Actually, don't do that. Okay? Don't drive backwards on the freeway. I'm hoping you know that. That was just an example. If you go ahead and you walk into a store, here's another example. You walk into Ralph's and you say, you know what? I don't feel like paying for the food. I feel like I have a right to the food. And so you start loading up your cart and you just start walking out with all your food. You will find out that the government has the ability to go ahead and enforce its decisions and compel your obedience, because they will throw you in jail. Okay? That's the authority of a government. But legitimacy is something different. Legitimacy is the popular acceptance of the right of the government to exercise authority. It's when the public goes ahead and says, yeah, that's okay, that's appropriate for you to go ahead and do that. You can exercise your authority. The popular acceptance of that. And this is one of the ways in which democracies are unique. So I want us to think about the different kinds of governments that we've talked about before. We've talked about totalitarian governments, theocracies, authoritarian governments, and democracies. In a totalitarian government, does the government have authority? Well, yes, it does. And by the way, look at your lecture notes, because you have the chance of either circling a yes or a no. Make sure you circle the correct one. Do those kind of governments, totalitarian governments, have authority? Yes, they do. Think about North Korea. You do something wrong, the government will go ahead and compel your obedience. It will enforce its decisions and compel your obedience. Heck, if you just try and go to South Korea, you'll get thrown in jail. Do those governments have legitimacy? Well, no, they don't. I mean, one of the reasons that North Korea, the government has to keep people from leaving, is because if they could leave, they would get out. So they have to guard people to make sure they stay in, right? Those governments don't have legitimacy. What about theocracies and authoritarian governments? Do those kind of governments have authority? Well, yes, they do. Do they have legitimacy? Well, it's hard to know. Maybe yes, maybe no. You know, in Iran, although for Americans, the idea of, sort of Iran having these religious leaders be in charge seems like it goes against all the things that we believe. It may very well be that many people in Iran are okay with the idea of the religious leaders being in charge. So maybe they do think they have legitimacy. Maybe they do think it's okay. It's a little bit less clear. That's a yes, maybe it's a no. It's hard to know. But in a democracy, do the governments have authority? Well, yes, they most certainly do have authority, as we talked about. If you go ahead and you walk into Ralph's and try and take all their food without paying for it. But do they have legitimacy? Do democracies have legitimacy? Well, that's where it's unique. In that democracies, yes, the government does have legitimacy too, in large part because the people were responsible for selecting the government. Even in the case of the 2000 elections, right? This is the presidential election. Al Gore got more votes than George Bush, right? But George Bush became president because we have the Electoral College. And people were very upset about that. And wrote letters to the editor and complained. Some people said, I'm moving out of the country, all that kind of stuff. But the reality was when power was transferred from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, right? When power was transferred over, there were no tanks in the streets. People were all pissed off, you know, mostly Democrats. Democrats are all pissed off, like, this is wrong. The Supreme Court gave they gave the presidency to George Bush. I'm so mad. Okay, I'm going back to work. And then they just went back to work. Everybody just went back to work. Because in our system, the government is legitimate. And we figure, okay, this is the way it worked out. We're going to move on. That's why tanks don't roll down in the streets. As a matter of fact, one of the things I love about our political system, and one of the things I watch all the time, are the inaugurations, when a new president is leaving and another president comes in. Because in our political system, think about how much power the government has, and think about how much power a president has. And yet, we hand power from one person to the next person almost without incident. And it can be transferring power from one party to another party that we completely disagree, that one side completely disagrees with. Democrats handing power to Republicans, Republicans handing power to Democrats, and yet still, we just do it. Oh, here you go. Here's the power. Our governments, democratic governments, have both authority and they have legitimacy. And that's one of the unique things about democracies. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are the conditions that must exist in order to preserve a democratic form of government. What kind of things need to exist? But I'm going to do that on Assessing Democracy 05.